Kansas Territory, 1873. The wind beat against the clapboard siding of the farmhouse as Augusta Rylan stood on the porch holding her son close, her daughter clinging to her skirts. The sky was swollen gray, the kind that pressed down on a person's chest. Her husband's words still rang in her ears, cruel and flat as the land around them. "No one will care if you leave, Augusta. You are nothing without me." He had said it that morning after throwing his coffee tin across the kitchen and scaring the children half to tears. She had not cried. Not then. She had just packed what little they had, some clothes, a shawl, a Bible with her mother's name inside, and walked out with her 2 children. No horse, no cart, just her own 2 feet and the long road east. It had taken them 2 days to get clear of the homestead. The boy, Caleb, was 6 and brave. The girl, Clara, was 4 and quiet. They slept under a willow tree one night, behind a stone wall the next. Augusta kept them moving, even as her feet bled and her hands shook when she thought too long about what she had done. They had crossed into Morris County by the time the storm started. Rain came down in sheets, hard and cold. Augusta wrapped the children in her shawl, but it was not enough. She stumbled along the muddy trail, her skirts soaked to the knees, until a light flickered ahead through the trees. A barn. Big, red, with the doors slightly parted, she pushed through, half carrying Clara, Caleb at her side. The scent of hay and horses filled the air. Inside, a man stood with a lantern, watching her like he did not know if she was real or not. He was tall, wide-shouldered, with a tan duster clinging to him and a black hat pulled low. His face was all sharp lines and sun, but his eyes were kind. "You hurt?" he asked, voice low. Augusta shook her head. "No, just need a place for the children to get warm." "Please," he nodded once and stepped aside. "Come in. You can dry off by the stove, got coffee left. I'm Xavier Ames, folks call me Zav." She hesitated, then walked past him, holding Clara close. Caleb looked up at the man, then followed after her. The barn was warm. A small stove glowed near the far wall. A bedroll lay to the side, along with saddlebags and a rifle propped up against a beam. Xavier poured coffee into a tin cup and handed it to her. "I can heat up more," he said, crouching beside the stove. Augusta wrapped her hands around the cup. "Thank you." He nodded again, then turned to Caleb. "You hungry, partner?" Caleb nodded. Xavier pulled a tin of beans from his pack and set it on the stove. He moved with the quiet calm of someone who had spent a lot of time alone. They did not speak much that night. The storm beat on, and Augusta sat with the children near the stove, drying their clothes as best she could. Xavier gave them blankets. He did not ask questions. He just made sure they were fed and warm, and then he slept sitting up near the barn doors, his rifle across his lap. By morning the rain had stopped, leaving the world slick and clean. "You got folks?" Xavier asked as he saddled his horse. "No," Augusta said. He studied her face then, like he was trying to piece something together. "Where are you headed?" "I do not rightly know." "You should not be out here alone with 2 little ones. You need a place. I got a cabin north of here, about a half-day's ride. You can come with me, just to rest, not asking anything more than that." Augusta looked down at Clara asleep in her lap. "You do not even know me." "I know what it means when someone's running from hurt." Her throat tightened. She looked back up at him. His face was steady, his voice even. "You do not have to trust me," he said, "but I will not let you keep walking into nothing." She nodded. They rode together that day. Xavier let Caleb sit in front of him on his horse, while Augusta rode behind on a mule he had tied up behind the barn. It was not easy. Her muscles ached and the children were tired, but Xavier kept a slow pace. He pointed out creeks and birds, made Clara laugh with a crow sound, and let Caleb hold the reins. When the trail was clear by dusk, they reached the cabin. It sat at the edge of a meadow surrounded by pine and cottonwood. Smoke curled from the chimney. A dog barked once, then wagged its tail and ran up to meet them. Xavier dismounted and helped Augusta down, his hands warm and careful at her waist. Inside, the cabin was small but clean. 1 room, a table, 2 chairs, a bed, and a cot. Augusta stood in the doorway, silent. It felt like a place that had been waiting for someone to come home to it. "You can have the bed," Xavier said. "I will take the cot." That night after the children fell asleep, Augusta sat by the hearth while Xavier whittled a piece of wood into the shape of a bird. "You married?" she asked. He shook his head, not for a long time. He did not ask what had happened to her, he seemed to already know. "Why are you helping us?" she asked. He looked at her then, really looked. "Because someone told you no one would care if you left, and that is a damn lie," her breath caught. She stared at the fire, her hands tight around her shawl. "You do not even know what I have been through," she whispered. "I do not need to, I can see it in your eyes." She did not say anything else, but she did not look away from him either. The next few days were quiet. Xavier chopped wood, checked his traps, let Caleb help carry firewood. Augusta cleaned the cabin, mended a torn shirt of his, cooked what little she could find in the pantry. They did not talk much, but something passed between them in the silent small glances, the way he gently touched her arm when passing the salt, the way she smiled when he showed Clara how to feed the chickens. One afternoon, Augusta found Caleb asleep against Xavier's side on the porch while he carved a horse out of wood. Her son's head rested on his leg like it belonged there. That night, as they washed dishes together, Xavier said, "You do not have to stay. But if you want to, we could make this place yours too." She stared at him, heart pounding. "I do not have anything left," she said. "You have your children, you have your strength. That is more than most." Augusta wiped her hands on a cloth, then looked up at him. "I was told I would not be missed, that no one would care." He stepped closer. He was wrong. She looked up into his face. For the first time in a long time she believed it, and for the first time in years she let herself hope. The frost came in slowly, laying its silver hands across the grass and the cabin's window panes. By the time November settled in, the days were short and the nights pressed close. Augusta found herself rising before daylight, stirring cornmeal mush over the hearth while the children slept under quilts that smelled of pine and smoke. Xavier had added a second cot near the fire after splitting a grove of aspen down by the creek. He worked with quiet purpose, bringing in dry kindling and checking the smokehouse, his boots leaving dark prints across the packed earth floor. Some evenings, he would come in with the scent of rabbit on him or a bloody satchel from a deer brought down near the ridge. That morning, while the sun still hadn't cleared the hills, Augusta stepped outside with a basket and a shawl drawn tight. The air cut sharp against her skin, but the cold steadied her. She moved to the side of the cabin, where the line of frost-hardened cabbages lay low and stubborn in the garden plot. She knelt, pulling two up by the roots, her fingers stiff with the effort. Behind her, the cabin door creaked. "You always move like you're trying not to be noticed," Xavier said, voice rough with sleep. "I spent long enough being told to stay quiet," she said without turning. He stepped beside her, crouched, and took the basket from her hands. "You don't have to do that here." She stood slowly, brushing dirt from her palms. "It's not something I can put down like a coat." His gaze lingered on her face, thoughtful. "Maybe not, but if you ever get tired of carrying it, I'll help." The wind pulled at a lock of her hair. She didn't answer, but she didn't look away either. Later, she found Caleb sitting on a stump near the edge of the woods, his face drawn with worry. He held a folded scrap of paper, creased and dirty from fingers too small to keep it straight. "What's that?" she asked, crouching beside him. He held it out without speaking. She unfolded it. A rough drawing in charcoal, 3 stick figures standing under a crooked roof, one of them much taller than the others. The tall one had a hat. "Did you draw this?" He nodded. "It's us and Mr. Xavier." Augusta's heart twisted. She looked at her son's small, solemn face. "You think of this as your home?" He hesitated, then nodded again. "It feels like one." She pressed a kiss to his head. "That's good, Caleb, that's real good." Inside, Xavier was oiling the hinges on the cabin door. She watched him for a moment through the window, his movements patient and steady, the kind of patience that came from years of doing things alone. That evening, when the children were asleep, and the last of the fire's warmth curled through the room, Augusta pulled out the tin box where she kept her mother's Bible and the few coins she hadn't traded for food. She turned the pages slowly, not reading anything, just running her fingers over the familiar paper. Xavier was using a whetstone on his knife, his shoulder catching the firelight. You said once that you hadn't been married in a long time, Augusta said. He kept sharpening, not startled. I did. What happened? He set the knife down. She died. Fever took her before the spring thaw. We didn't have children. Augusta nodded once. I'm sorry. Was a long time ago, still feels close some nights. She didn't speak for a while. The fire cracked, soft and low. I didn't love the man I married, she said at last. Not really. I think I convinced myself I did because I was too scared of what it would mean if I didn't. Xavier didn't fill the silence. He just waited. He wanted someone who would stay quiet, stay grateful. I did that for years. But I kept shrinking, like I was folding in on myself. She looked at him then, really looked. He met her eyes and didn't look away. Do you think someone can come back from that? She asked. I think you already are, he said. A log popped in the fire. She stood slowly and crossed to the hearth, then bent and added another piece of wood. Her hands didn't tremble this time. The next day, Xavier brought home a cedar branch he'd cut down near the edge of the property. He laid it across the table and began stripping the bark with care. What's it for? Augusta asked, wiping her hands on her apron. Gonna make a cradle, he said, not looking up. She froze. I'm not, I know, he said. I meant for Clara. For now, she's still small enough to need a place of her own. Augusta exhaled. That's kind of you. He looked up then, his expression unreadable. Not just kindness. She didn't ask for more, but when she turned back to the stove, her hand lingered on the table beside the cedar. That night, Xavier lifted Clara from the quilt pile on the floor and placed her gently into the half-finished cradle. She stirred once, then settled, one hand tucked under her cheek. Augusta watched him from the rocker, her fingers curled around a patch of mending. You're good with them, she said. I've had to learn. He crouched beside the cradle, adjusting the blanket. They deserve someone who looks out for them. She stood and crossed the room, her bare feet silent on the floorboards. So do I. He looked up at her, his eyes steady. You do. She reached out, touched his cheek. His hand came up, covering hers. Outside, the moon rose over the pines. Inside, the warmth held by early December, the snow had settled deep in the folds of the land, muffling even the sound of the birds. The cabin sat tucked against the forest edge like it had always belonged there, smoke curling from the chimney into a pale sky. Augusta stood at the window before dawn, watching the frost feather across the glass, a wool shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. She hadn't meant to stay this long. But each day seemed to stitch itself to the next with a quiet sort of purpose. Xavier's boots crunched through the snow as he returned from checking the snares. He stepped inside and set the burlap sack near the door without speaking. The air between them had changed, not crowded or uncertain, just filled with things neither had named yet. Augusta poured him a tin of hot water steeped with dried mint. You're limping. He pulled off one glove, caught my foot in a frozen rut. Nothing worth fussing over. She crouched beside his chair and gently unwrapped the wool from his ankle. The skin was bruised but not broken. You should rest it today. I can't afford to. You already brought in enough meat to last the week. The earth isn't asking more of you than you've given. He didn't argue, but he didn't agree either. His hand brushed hers when she wrapped the cloth back around his ankle. He didn't move it away. Later that morning, while Xavier slept propped against the wall with a blanket over his legs, Augusta slipped outside to the woodshed with Clara bundled in her arms. The girl had grown quieter since the snow fell, speaking mostly in whispers. Augusta had begun to wonder if the cold reminded her of things she didn't yet know how to say. Inside the shed, the air smelled of cedar and smoke. Augusta set Clara down on a crate and began stacking kindling into a basket. Mama, Clara said softly, is Mr. Xavier our kin? No, sweetheart. Then why does he make us soup and build us beds? Augusta paused, a small breath caught in her chest. Because sometimes people choose to be your kin, because they want to. Clara nodded, satisfied, and rested her head against the wall. That evening, Augusta found Xavier at the back of the cabin, carving a length of pine into narrow slats. He looked up as she approached, his breath ghosting in the air. You're building something? Cupboard for the kitchen wall. Thought you could use a place for the herbs you've been drying. She leaned against the doorframe. You pay attention to things most men wouldn't. He set the wood aside. I've had enough silence in my life to learn what matters. He stood, brushing the snow from his coat, and looked at her without expectation. I know I don't have much to offer, he said, but if you ever wanted to stay longer than a season, I'd make room. She stepped closer, her breath visible between them. You already have. That night, after the children had gone to bed under the quilts, Augusta sat by the hearth with her sewing and watched Xavier mend the leather strap on his saddlebag. The fire lit the side of his face in a soft gold. I've been thinking about work, she said. There's a schoolhouse 2 valleys over. They'll need someone come spring. You were a teacher before I married. I used to sing the alphabet to the little ones until they caught on. He nodded slowly. Seems like something you'd be good at. I'd like the children to know a world bigger than what we've run from. He set the strap aside and met her eyes. You've got the right to build whatever kind of life you want now. She hesitated. Would you be a part of it? His answer came quiet but certain. I already am. She crossed to him and rested her hand over his. He turned it palm up and held hers gently, like he'd been waiting to do it for a long time. Outside, a fox yipped in the distance. Inside, warmth and silence settled thick between them, not the kind that required filling, but the kind that gave room to breathe. Augusta leaned her head against his shoulder, and he didn't move. They sat like that until the fire burned low, and the room grew still but for the sound of wind brushing the eaves. By the second week of December, the creek behind the cabin had frozen over, its surface a dull pane of gray, the current stilled beneath a crust of ice. The snow had grown deeper, heavy enough that Xavier had to shovel a narrow path from the front steps to the shed each morning. Augusta began stitching a pair of mittens from an old wool coat, the leather palms cut from a saddlebag too cracked to mend. With each stitch, her fingers grew surer, her thoughts clearer. The days had settled into a rhythm that felt like something earned, not borrowed. That morning, Xavier returned from checking the fence line with a scrap of news. He stepped inside, brushing snow from his shoulders, and set a folded paper on the table. Ran into a ranch hand riding into Council Grove. He said the preacher's wife passed along a letter meant for me. Left it at the general store weeks back, but I hadn't gone in. Augusta wiped her hands on her apron and glanced at the paper. From someone you know, my sister, lives near Salina. I haven't seen her in 4 years. He unfolded the letter and read it in silence, his eyes scanning the page with a stillness that told her it mattered. When he finished, he placed the letter face down with care. She's taken in 2 orphaned boys. Wants to know if I can come help build them a sleeping loft come spring. Augusta stepped around the table. Will you go? I think I should, he said. She's alone out there, always took care of me when Pa ran off. Clara's footsteps sounded from the loft ladder. She padded across the room, still bundled in her nightdress, and climbed into Augusta's lap without a word, resting her head against her chest. Xavier watched them both for a moment, then said quietly, I'd like you to come with me, all of you. Augusta's breath caught. That's a long ride. Closer to 4 days if we pack light. We'd need to wait for the thaw. She looked down at Clara's hair, warm and tangled from sleep. You'd make room for us there. I'd build the room myself. That night, after the children were asleep, they sat by the fire with the letter between them. Xavier passed his fingers over the edge of the paper, the calluses at his knuckles catching candlelight. I used to think I'd die on my own land, same place I was born, he said. But I got to thinking, it's not the land that makes a place worth staying, it's who's standing beside you. Augusta didn't speak for a long time. She let the quiet settle, let the warmth of it wrap around her like the wool shawl she wore. When she finally looked at him, her eyes were steady. What if I'm not standing beside you? What if I'm walking there too? He smiled, slow and sure. Then that's the only road I want to be on. In the days that followed, they began to prepare. Xavier repaired the wagon he kept under a lean-to, replacing the broken spoke with a length of ash. Augusta sorted through what they could take: flour, beans, the good quilt, Caleb's spelling primer, and set aside what they could trade for grain once they reached Salina. One morning, Caleb asked if he could help Xavier mend the harness. Xavier handed him a strip of rawhide and said, "Cut it even. 10 inches, straight as you can." The boy's hands weren't steady, but his face was set with purpose. From the doorway, Augusta watched them in silence, her heart aching with a kind of joy she hadn't let herself feel in years. That evening, as the fire burned low and the wind sighed through the trees, Augusta stood at the window while Xavier dried the dishes behind her. "I was afraid," she said at last. "I was afraid I'd broken something in myself that couldn't be fixed." He set the tin plate on the shelf. "You didn't break, you were bent under something too heavy for one person to carry." She turned. "And now you're standing. That's enough." She stepped to him, her hand finding his. "It's more than enough." He pulled her close, his breath warm at her temple. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, without words, he kissed her. Not with hunger or haste, but with the quiet certainty of someone who had waited without ever asking. Outside, the snow fell in slow spirals, blanketing the path they'd walked to reach each other. Inside, the fire held steady, and the cabin no longer felt like a place between lives. It felt like the beginning of one. The thaw came late that year. March opened with brittle winds and mornings so cold Xavier had to chip ice from the water barrel with the back of his axe. But by the third week, the ground softened and green pushed through the frost-hardened soil in thin, brave blades. The creek groaned, then cracked open under the sun, its current catching light like loose silver thread. The days lengthened slow and honest. They began packing in earnest. Augusta rolled the quilts tight and wrapped them in waxed cloth stitched from feed sacks. Clara carried wooden spoons to the wagon one by one, her arms too small to manage more. Caleb folded the canvas cover with quiet pride, careful to match the corners. Xavier checked the harness, then checked it again, taking an hour to oil the leather and smooth the worn places with the heel of his hand. One evening, Augusta sat on the stone step, brushing the dust from a bundle of dried sage. Xavier came to stand beside her, a tin cup in one hand, his other resting on the doorframe. "I finished the brace for the wagon box," he said. "It'll hold steady over the ridge." She nodded, eyes on the sage. "I found my mother's sewing needle in the bottom of the tin. I thought I'd lost it when we left." He sat beside her, the wood of the step creaking beneath his weight. "Funny how the things that last ain't always what we expect." She looked at him then, her face drawn quiet with thought. "I keep wondering what it'll feel like to arrive somewhere not because I'm running, but because I chose it." He didn't answer right away. The wind moved through the trees, bringing the scent of thawed earth and distant cottonwood sap. "You'll know," he said at last. "When you see it, you'll know." 2 days later, they hitched the team. The children rode in back, wrapped in quilts, a small cedar box holding their few toys tucked beneath the bench. Xavier drove, one hand steady on the reins, the other resting light beside Augusta's on the seat between them. She wore her mother's shawl, the edges mended where a moth had chewed through last winter. The road west was muddy in places, rutted deep from the wheels of other wagons bound for spring markets. They passed a trader leading 2 mules and a family repairing a broken axle with pine limbs. Each night they camped near creeks or in the shadow of wind-worn bluffs, Xavier making a lean-to from the wagon canvas while Augusta cooked beans or salt pork over the fire. On the 4th night, they slept beneath a stand of willows, their branches trailing like threadbare curtains. Caleb curled into Xavier's side without asking, and Clara's fingers stayed wrapped in Augusta's braid until she drifted off. They reached Salina in early April. The town had grown since Xavier last saw it. A new church steeple rose above the rooftops, and a row of whitewashed storefronts lined the main street. They turned off the road just before the river, heading north along a narrow trail that led to a clapboard house set back among prairie grass and young cottonwoods. A woman stood on the porch, her apron tied crooked over a blue dress. She had Xavier's eyes but none of his reserve. She came down the steps barefoot, wiping her hands on her skirt, and pulled him into a fierce, wordless hug. "You took your time," she said, pulling back. "Had a few reasons to," he answered, glancing toward Augusta. His sister turned, her gaze sharp and welcoming all at once. "You must be the ones he wouldn't stop writing about." Augusta stepped down from the wagon, her fingers tight on Clara's hand. "We're grateful to be here," the woman smiled. "Well, I'm grateful you brought him back looking better than he's looked in years." I'm Miriam." The boys came out of the house then, both gang-limbed and red-cheeked, and Xavier introduced Caleb like he'd always been part of the family. That night, they all ate around a table big enough to hold them, the windows open to let in the smell of damp earth and wild onion. In the weeks that followed, Xavier helped raise the loft for the boys, and Augusta began tending the small garden at the back of the house, coaxing peas and turnips from the warming soil. She taught the children letters in the afternoons, using a slate Miriam had tucked away from her own school days. And in the evenings, she and Xavier sat on the porch with their hands brushing, the sound of frogs carrying from the fields. One morning in May, Xavier handed her a small box carved from walnut. Inside lay a silver ring, plain and worn smooth with time. "It was my mother's," he said. "I've carried it a long while, not as a burden. Just waiting for the right hands to wear it again." Augusta looked at him, her eyes unreadable, then slid the ring over her finger. "I never thought I'd get to choose a life or a man, but I've chosen you." They were married under the cottonwoods 2 days later. Miriam wept through the whole thing, and the boys scattered wildflowers along the grass. Caleb stood tall beside Xavier, and Clara held Augusta's hand tightly, her curls pinned back with a ribbon Miriam had saved for something special. After the vows, Xavier leaned close and said, "You're not just standing beside me now, you're the whole reason I'm still standing." Augusta kissed him, her hand over his heart. "And I'll be here through every spring and every storm. This time, I'm not leaving." They built a home a mile north of Miriam's, near the bend in the river where the grass grew thick and the soil turned black with promise. They planted corn and sunflowers, kept chickens, and raised the children with steady hands and open hearts. Years passed. The cradle Xavier built became Clara's doll bed. Caleb helped Xavier fence the pasture one summer, taller now, the set of his shoulders already echoing the man who raised him. And still, every morning, Xavier rose before the sun, quietly stoked the fire, and pressed a kiss to Augusta's temple as she stirred beside him. She always opened her eyes, even if only for a second, and smiled like each day was a gift they'd earned with every step they'd taken to get there. Their life was not grand or easy, but it was theirs and it was good, and they were never alone again.